The War Council chamber on Nexus Prime held representatives from 43 species, and not one of them looked happy to see the humans arrive. Lieutenant Commander Sarah stood at attention, while the battle reports scrolled across the holographic display above them. Red markers showed enemy advances across 6 sectors. Blue markers showed coalition forces retreating. It had been this way for 3 years. The humans bring 12 cargo vessels and 8 escort frigates, announced High Coordinator, his translator rendering his chittering speech into flat, unimpressed words. This contribution is noted. Kept her face neutral. She'd expected this. Humanity had only achieved faster-than-light travel 15 years ago. They were the members of the Galactic Defense Coalition, and their technology was generations behind everyone else in the room. The representative actually laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "Perhaps they can deliver our mail," the said. "We're here to help however we can," replied. She didn't mention that her 12 cargo ships had crossed more space in the last decade than most species managed in a century. She didn't mention that human civilization had been built on the bones of failed supply chains, and that every lesson had been written in blood and bankruptcy. Segmented body rippled in what might have been a shrug. "You will be assigned to Supply Depot 17, servicing the third front. Quartermaster will provide orientation." He waved a manipulator appendage dismissively. "Next item." And her team of 20 logistics officers were escorted to a transport that took them 3 days into what the coalition politely called the quiet sector. Knew what that meant. It meant the sector where nothing important happened. The sector where the coalition sent people they wanted to forget about. Supply Depot 17 orbited a brown dwarf star in a system with nothing worth fighting over. When their transport docked, got her first look at the depot through the viewing port. It was massive, easily 3 kilometers across, a floating warehouse city built from prefabricated modules that different species had contributed over the years. None of the modules quite matched. It looked like someone had glued together a dozen different buildings and called it done. Quartermaster met them at the airlock. He was a species that looked like a cross between a crab and a centipede, with a body covered in data ports and neural interface plugs. He'd been managing supply depots for 200 years, and his pride in this fact radiated from every mechanical gesture. "Humans," he said, his voice synthesized through a vocoder. "I have read about your species. You still use paper records in some places, yes. For some things, admitted. Redundancy is important." Mandibles clacked in what might have been laughter. "How charmingly primitive. Here, we use the most advanced inventory management systems in the galaxy. Every item is tracked by AI. Every shipment is optimized for maximum efficiency. The quartermaster caste has perfected these systems over." Followed him through the depot corridors. Through open doorways, she saw warehouses stacked floor to ceiling with containers. Alien workers moved through the spaces with slow, methodical precision, checking tablets and scanning codes. Everything looked orderly. Everything looked efficient. Her instincts screamed that something was wrong. "How long does it take to process a request for ammunition?" she asked. "The AI analyzes the request, verifies authorization, determines optimal delivery route and schedules transport," said. "Average processing time is 42 hours. 42 hours stopped walking for ammunition. The system must be thorough. Errors cannot be tolerated." Looked at her second-in-command, Lieutenant. He raised his eyebrows in the way that meant he was thinking the same thing she was. This was going to be worse than they'd thought. Over the next week, his team conducted what they called an assessment audit. They didn't ask permission because they'd learned long ago that asking permission meant getting told no. They simply requested access to records, claiming they needed to familiarize themselves with coalition procedures. Confident in his systems, granted access without hesitation. What they found was a nightmare wrapped in a bureaucracy and tied with red tape. The AI system was indeed sophisticated. It tracked every item perfectly, knew exactly where everything was located, and could calculate optimal shipping routes down to the last decimal point of fuel efficiency. But it was optimized for a perfect world, and war was anything but perfect. The system couldn't handle chaos. It couldn't adapt to changing circumstances. When a ship requested supplies early because they'd taken damage in battle, the AI flagged it as an irregularity and put the request into a review queue. When a depot ran low on medical supplies, the AI would ship them from the central warehouse 3 systems away rather than pull from a Depot 1 system over because that depot was assigned to a different sector. Found ammunition sitting in Depot 17's warehouses that had been there for 8 months. Meanwhile, ships on the third front were rationing rounds because their requests were stuck in the optimization queue. She found medical supplies that had expired in storage, while field hospitals sent desperate priority requests that were being processed in order. She found repair parts for ships that had been destroyed 2 years ago, still carefully and maintained. "It's like they've never heard a fog of war," said one night as they reviewed data in their tiny office. "Everything is planned for perfect conditions." "Not just that," said, highlighting a shipping route on her display. "Look at this. The AI routes supply ships to avoid all combat zones, which makes sense, but it adds 4 days to every delivery. 4 days. When a ship is out of missiles and facing enemy bombers, 4 days might as well be 4 years." She pulled up another file, one that made her jaw tighten. "And this. Field commanders have zero discretionary authority. If a captain needs emergency supplies, he can't just grab them from a passing supply ship. He has to submit a request, wait for approval, wait for the AI to schedule delivery. I found one case where a captain had to wait 6 days for a replacement part, while a supply convoy carrying that exact part passed through his system. The convoy couldn't stop because it would disrupt the delivery schedule." "This is insane," said Lieutenant Sarah Park, their inventory specialist. "How are they even still fighting?" "That's the thing," said quietly. "They're not really fighting, they're losing slowly." She pulled up the battle reports for the Third Front. They weren't winning through brilliant tactics or superior firepower. They were winning through persistence. They'd advance, the coalition would counterattack, and then both sides would pause while they waited for supplies. Except they could wait longer because their supply system, while probably just as bureaucratic, had shorter distances to cover. They were closer to their home territory. "They are strangling on their logistics too," realized. "That's why this front has stalled. Both sides are fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. The difference is, their hand is tied a little less tightly than ours." "So what do we do?" asked. Smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. "We do what humans do best. We improvise, adapt, and overcome. Gave us authority to familiarize ourselves with procedures. Well, I think we need a very thorough familiarization, starting with fixing this mess." "He's not going to like it," Park warned. "Probably not," agreed. "Good thing it's easier to ask forgiveness than permission." She pulled up a map of the Third Front, marking supply depots, fleet positions, and shipping lanes. "Here's what we're going to do. We're going to build a new system right under their noses. We'll call it a pilot program, a human efficiency study. We'll use small words and boring presentations so nobody pays attention. And we're going to start by doing something radical." "What's that?" asked. "We're going to ask the people doing the actual work what they need." Over the next month's team worked 16-hour days. They interviewed ship captains, depot workers, repair crews, and field medics. They asked simple questions. What do you need? When do you need it? What problems do you face? The answers painted a picture of a supply system that looked perfect in reports but crumbled under real conditions. They started small, convinced to let them experiment with the human cargo ships, running them on what she called flexible routes. Instead of following optimized AI schedules, human captains would carry mixed loads and make stops based on actual need. If a ship was heading to Depot 23 and got a distress call from a frigate that needed ammunition, they could detour. Revolutionary. Approved it because he thought it would fail and prove the superiority of AI optimization. Your primitive methods will create chaos, he predicted confidently, but you will learn. The first human supply run completed in half the time of a normal AI-scheduled delivery. The captain had dropped medical supplies at a field hospital, picked up damaged equipment for repair, delivered ammunition to 2 different ships, and still arrived at the destination depot ahead of schedule. Luck said. The second, third, and fourth runs had similar results. Anomalies insisted. By the end of the month, ships were requesting human supply runs specifically. Captains started calling them miracle runs because supplies actually arrived when needed instead of when scheduled. His team kept meticulous records, building a case with data that even the AI couldn't argue with. But new data alone wouldn't be enough. She needed a demonstration that nobody could ignore. She needed to show the coalition what was possible when logistics actually worked. She found her opportunity in a distress call from the light carrier Steadfast. The ship had taken damage in a skirmish and was stranded in hostile space, low on fuel and ammunition, with wounded crew. According to the AI system, the Steadfast would receive supplies in 76 hours. The captain reported they had maybe 30 hours before patrols found them. Looked at her team. They looked back at her. No one said the obvious thing, which was that they'd be in serious trouble if this went wrong. Gear up, said. We're going to show them how humans do logistics. Lieutenant grinned. Now we're talking. They loaded 2 of their fastest cargo ships with everything the Steadfast might need, grabbing supplies from 3 different depots without waiting for authorization. Figured she'd either be proven right or court-martialed, and either way, she wouldn't have to work for any more. The rescue run took 14 hours of hard flying through dangerous space. They reached the Steadfast with time to spare, transferred supplies, and pulled out just as scouts arrived in the system. When returned to Depot 17, she found High Coordinator waiting for her. Her career was probably over. Instead, translator crackled with something that might have been approval. The captain of the Steadfast sends his gratitude, said. He also notes that if human supply runs can be arranged for his battle group, he believes they can begin offensive operations. Stood, sir, with your permission, I think we can do better than that. Explain. Give us 3 months, said. Give us access to the third front supply network. Let us implement our systems properly. If it doesn't work, you can send us home, but if it does work, yes, then we can win this war. Was silent for a long moment. Finally, he said, You have 2 months. Show me results, Commander. As Left approached, his mandibles clicking anxiously. You cannot seriously believe your chaos will improve upon a refined procedure. Smiled at him. Let me tell you about a battle called Stalingrad and what happens when supply lines fail. The real work was about to begin. Within 6 weeks, the Third Front transformed. His team had implemented what they called the supply mesh network, and it was spreading through the sector like a virus. The concept was simple, almost insultingly so to the alien officers who'd spent centuries perfecting their systems. Every ship, every depot, every field unit had real-time access to inventory data across the entire sector. Not just their assigned supplies, but everyone's supplies. The system ran on a principle that made the quartermaster cast deeply uncomfortable: trust. A frigate captain who needed ammunition could see that a destroyer 3 light towers away had extra rounds in storage. The captain could request a direct transfer. If the destroyer captain agreed, the exchange happened immediately. No AI approval, no 42-hour processing time, no bureaucratic review. Just 2 officers making a decision and executing it. This is madness, Quartermaster declared during one of the daily briefings. How do you prevent theft? How do you maintain accountability? What if supplies go missing? Lieutenant answered while worked on a fuel distribution problem. We track everything, same as you. The difference is we track it after the transaction, not before. Speed now, paperwork later. That violates every protocol. Yeah, agreed cheerfully. It's great, isn't it? The results spoke louder than subjections. Ships that had been combat-ready 60% of the time were now operational 94% of the time. Wounded soldiers received treatment in hours instead of days. Repair parts arrived before ships had to shut down for maintenance. The coalition forces on the Third Front, which had been slowly retreating for 2 years, suddenly stopped losing ground. Secret weapon wasn't technology. It was something humans had learned through centuries of warfare. Logistics wasn't about perfect systems. It was about people making good decisions quickly. She'd implemented other human concepts too. Cross-training meant a mechanic could perform basic medical triage in an emergency. Standardization meant that whenever possible, different species used compatible equipment. Surge capacity reserves sat at strategic choke points, ready for rapid deployment. She even mandated something that made the aliens think she'd lost her mind: coffee breaks and shift rotations for depot workers. Why would we reduce working hours? Demanded. That decreases efficiency. Actually, Lieutenant Park explained, showing him the data, tired workers make mistakes. Mistakes cost more time than breaks do. Our workers are processing requests 30% faster because they're not exhausted. They noticed the change too. Their intelligence reports noted increased coalition activity on the Third Front, increased readiness, increased combat effectiveness. For the first time in 3 years, coalition forces weren't just defending, they were probing for weaknesses, testing, preparing. Received summons to Nexus Prime. She expected questions, maybe skepticism. Instead, she walked into a council chamber filled with senior officers who'd actually read her reports. High Coordinator gestured to the holographic display, which now showed the Third Front stabilized and even pushing back in 2 sectors. Explain your methods, said, not a request, a command. Had prepared for this. She pulled up a presentation that she and her team had spent days simplifying. They'd removed all the jargon, all the complex theory. They'd made it as basic as possible because they'd learned that complicated explanations made people suspicious. The current system is optimized for efficiency, she began. That works fine in peacetime. In war, efficiency isn't enough. You need adaptability. She showed them the comparison data. AI-rooted supply ships followed perfect paths but couldn't handle changes. Human-rooted ships took longer on paper but could respond to emergencies, combine deliveries, and make real-time decisions. The AI sees war as a math problem, continued. Calculate the optimal solution and execute. But war isn't math. It's chaos. It's things going wrong constantly. Human logistics evolved to handle chaos because we've been fighting wars for our entire history, and most of them were won or lost based on supply lines. She clicked to the next slide, showing historical examples. Napoleon's invasion of Russia failed because his supply lines stretched too far. The Allies won World War II partly because they could land supplies on beaches faster than the Germans expected. The Mars Rebellion of 2187 succeeded because corporate supply chains couldn't adapt to guerrilla tactics. Your species has considerable experience with failure, observed a admiral dryly. Exactly, said, not taking offense. We've failed at logistics so many times that we've learned every possible way it can go wrong, and we've learned how to fix it. She pulled up the key slide, the one that explained everything. The AI system has one point of failure, the AI. If it makes a wrong calculation, the whole system follows that error. Our system has 1,000 points of potential failure because it relies on individual decisions. But it also has 1,000 points of adaptation because each person can correct for local problems immediately. You are describing organized chaos, said. Yes, sir, I am. Because chaos is what war is. You can't eliminate it, so you build systems that work within it. The council chamber fell silent, waited, watching alien faces and body language she'd learned to read over the past months. Some were intrigued, some were skeptical, some were clearly offended by the suggestion that of refined procedures could be improved by primitives who still used paper. Finally spoke. The High Command has reviewed your results. We are authorizing implementation of your supply mesh network across all fronts. You will train logistics officers from other sectors. You will have access to whatever resources you require. Felt something unclench in her chest. Thank you, sir. Do not thank me yet, Commander. You must now prove this success was not merely fortune. You must prove it can scale. Many officers will resist these changes. They will see your methods as beneath their dignity or too disorderly. You will face considerable opposition. I understand, sir. What didn't say was that she'd expected the opposition. Humans had dealt with institutional resistance for centuries. Every innovation, every improvement, every change had been fought by people who preferred the old ways. She'd planned for it. Over the next 3 months, and her growing team of human logistics officers spread through coalition space like missionaries spreading a new religion. They called it the logistics gospel, always with a self-deprecating smile that made the aliens think they weren't serious. But they were deadly serious. They ran training sessions that focused on principles rather than procedures. They showed ship captains how to read the supply mesh and make requests directly. They taught depot workers how to use discretionary judgment. They implemented cross-training programs and standardization protocols. Most importantly, they gathered converts, logistics officers from other species who saw the results and wanted to learn. Not everyone was convinced. An admiral named commanded the Fifth Front and flatly refused to implement the new systems. I have managed supply lines for 300 years, he declared. I will not have primitives tell me how to do my duties. Didn't argue with him. She simply made sure the data from other fronts was available for anyone who wanted to see it. Ships on the Fifth Front noticed that ships on other fronts were getting supplied faster. Word spread. Captains started requesting transfers. So officers began quietly implementing supply mesh protocols without telling him. They were also taking notice, and they weren't happy about it. Their own supply lines were beginning to show strain as coalition forces pressed harder across multiple fronts. For 3 years, they had been steadily advancing because coalition logistics couldn't keep up. Now, suddenly, coalition fleets were well supplied, well maintained, and aggressive. The war was changing. Received intelligence reports showing responses. They were trying to extend their supply networks to match coalition reach. They were attempting to implement their own optimization improvements, but their rigid command structure made it nearly impossible. The quartermaster caste was even more bureaucratic than their coalition equivalents, and they refused to decentralize authority. They can't do what we do, Lieutenant Park observed during one briefing. Their entire culture is built on hierarchy and procedure. They can't just tell a supply sergeant to use his best judgment. That's their weakness, agreed, and we're going to exploit it. She pulled up a strategic map showing supply routes. They were impressive in their organization, but they all followed predictable patterns. Optimized patterns. The valued efficiency above all else, which meant their supply convoys took the shortest, fastest routes. Every time. We can't outfight them ship to ship, said, but we can outmaneuver them logistically. We can force them to extend their supply lines while keeping ours flexible. We can hit their convoys and fade away before reinforcements arrive because our ships can refuel and rearm faster than theirs can respond. Study the map. You're talking about turning logistics into a weapon. I'm talking about winning the war, corrected. Not with better guns, but with better supply chains. The strategy worked almost too well. Coalition raids on supply convoys increased dramatically. Human-designed tactics meant small, fast ships could hit a convoy, grab supplies for themselves, scatter the rest, and vanish before battleships arrived. The stolen supplies made the raids self-sustaining. Every successful attack made the next one easier. They responded by adding more escorts to their convoys, which slowed them down. They tried varying their routes, but AI optimization meant there were only so many efficient paths, and coalition forces learned to predict them. They attempted to build redundancy into their system, but their bureaucracy made it impossible to implement quickly. Watched the intelligence reports with satisfaction. They were making the same mistakes Napoleon made, the same mistakes the British made in the American Revolution, the same mistakes that had destroyed logistics networks throughout human history. They were trying to force efficiency onto chaos. 6 months after had arrived at Supply Depot 17, High Coordinator summoned her again. This time, she entered the council chamber to find representatives from all fronts present. The holographic display showed the entire war theater, and for the first time since the war began, blue markers outnumbered red markers in several sectors. "Commander," said formally, "the High Command wishes to acknowledge your contributions. You have transformed our logistics capabilities. Coalition forces are advancing on 4 fronts. Supply lines are under severe pressure. We believe we may have turned the tide of this war." Felt her team's eyes on her. Park and the others had worked themselves nearly to exhaustion making this happen. This wasn't her victory, it was theirs. "Thank you, sir," she said, "but we're not done yet." "Explain." Pulled up a new analysis her team had prepared. They are adapting. They're pulling back on some fronts to shorten their supply lines. They're consolidating forces. They're preparing for something big. She highlighted a sector near Coalition Core territory. Terminus Station. It's our primary supply hub. Every major route passes through it at some point. If they take Terminus, they cripple our logistics network for months. Terminus Station is heavily defended, pointed out. So was Pearl Harbor, said quietly. So was the line. Defenses don't matter if the enemy is willing to pay the price to break them, and I think they are desperate enough to try. The council chamber erupted in debate. Some officers thought was being paranoid. Others saw the logic. Terminus Station was the obvious target if they wanted to regain the initiative. "What do you propose?" asked, cutting through the noise. Smiled, "I propose we let them take it." The silence that followed was absolute. 3 weeks later, the Grand Fleet struck Terminus Station with overwhelming force. They'd gathered every available ship from 4 sectors, stripped escorts from supply convoys, and thrown everything into one massive assault. The station's defenders fought hard, but they were outnumbered 3-1. After 6 hours of brutal combat, they claimed victory. In the command ship, Fleet Master allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Terminus Station was the of coalition logistics. With it in hands, the enemy supply network would collapse. Coalition fleets would run out of ammunition, food, fuel. The war would turn back in the Imperium's favor. "Begin processing supply routes," ordered. "I want to know every shipment scheduled through this station. We will intercept them all." His logistics officer worked at the console, then paused, worked more frantically, stopped. "Reports," demanded. "Sir, there are no scheduled shipments." "Impossible. This is their primary hub." "Yes, sir. But according to these records, all regular traffic was rerouted 2 weeks ago. The station's warehouses are at minimal capacity. There are no supply ships in transit to this location." Felt something cold in his chest. "Show me coalition fleet positions." The tactical display lit up with blue markers. Coalition fleets were still fully operational, still advancing, still pressing forces across multiple fronts. The capture of Terminus Station hadn't slowed them at all. On the bridge of the coalition carrier Resolute, watched the same tactical display with quiet satisfaction. Around her, The Coalition command staff was beginning to understand what she'd done. "You evacuated Terminus 3 weeks ago," High Coordinator said. "You knew they would attack." "I suspected," corrected. "They needed a big win to reverse their logistics crisis. Terminus was the obvious target, so we made it an attractive target and prepared for them to take it." "But how are our ships being supplied?" "Pulled up the supply mesh network, now expanded across all Coalition territory. We built redundancy into the system from the start. Terminus was never a single point of failure. It was just the most efficient hub. When we saw the fleet massing, we rerouted everything through secondary hubs. The ships barely noticed the change." Lieutenant added, "The beauty of a decentralized system is that you can't cut off the head because there is no head. Every depot can function as a hub if needed. Every supply ship can make decisions independently. They took Terminus and found an empty warehouse. They wasted a third of their fleet strength on a meaningless target," realized. "Worse than meaningless," said. "To gather that fleet, they stripped escorts from their supply convoys across 4 sectors. Our raids have been hitting those convoys nonstop for the past week. They can hold Terminus, but their own supply network is collapsing." She pulled up intelligence reports showing fleet positions. Many ships were stationary, not because they were defending territory, but because they were waiting for fuel and supplies that weren't arriving. Ground forces were rationing ammunition. Repair facilities were overwhelmed with damaged ships that couldn't get replacement parts. "Their logistics network was already strained," explained. "They extended it past breaking point to take Terminus. Now it's snapping." Over the next 2 weeks, the supply crisis became catastrophic. Their fleet at Terminus Station couldn't hold the position without supplies, but supplies couldn't reach them because Coalition raids had disrupted every route. When they tried to send reinforcements, Coalition forces intercepted them. They were learning what Germany learned in World War II, what the British learned in Afghanistan, what corporations learned on Mars. You can win every battle and still lose the war if your supply lines fail. Received a priority message from Grand Fleet Command. They were requesting negotiations, not through normal diplomatic channels, but directly to Coalition Logistics Command. They wanted to talk to her specifically. The meeting took place on a neutral station, with diplomats from both sides present. Fleet Master attended via hologram, his alien features unreadable but his body language suggesting exhaustion. "Commander," said through his translator, "the Imperium wishes to discuss ceasefire terms." Glanced at the Coalition diplomats, who nodded for her to continue. This was unprecedented. The military commanders wanted to negotiate with a logistics officer. "The Imperium has not been defeated militarily," continued. "Our ships are still powerful, our soldiers are still capable, but—" he paused. "Our supply situation has become untenable. Every front reports shortages. Our convoys cannot operate safely. Our fleets cannot maintain operational readiness. We are being strangled." "I'm sorry to hear that," said, and meant it. War was terrible regardless of which side suffered. "I must understand," said. "How did your species become so proficient at logistics? The Imperium has studied warfare for. We have conquered half the galaxy. Yet you, a species that achieved FTL travel only recently, have defeated us not with weapons but with supply management. How?" Considered her answer carefully. "Fleet Master, humanity isn't naturally good at logistics. We're actually terrible at it. Our history is full of armies that starved while surrounded by farmland, of ships that ran out of ammunition while warehouses sat full at home, of soldiers who died from supply failures rather than enemy action." She pulled up historical data, human battles and campaigns spanning thousands of years. "We've been fighting wars since before we had written language. We've failed at logistics in every possible way. Armies too spread out, supply lines too long, resources in the wrong place at the wrong time. We've lost wars we should have won because we couldn't feed our soldiers." "Then how?" "Because we learn," said simply. Every failure taught us something. Every mistake showed us a better way. We didn't develop good logistics because we were smart. We developed it because we failed so many times that we had no choice but to get better. She zoomed in on specific examples. Napoleon's invasion of Russia failed because his supply lines couldn't keep up. We learned that distance matters more than speed. The American Civil War showed us that railroads could move supplies faster than traditional methods. World War II taught us that logistics determines strategy, not the other way around. Every war, every failure, every disaster added to our understanding. Was silent for a long moment. The Imperium's quartermaster caste has managed supply lines for 10,000 years. And they probably do it very efficiently, agreed. But efficiency isn't the same as effectiveness. Your systems work perfectly in perfect conditions. Ours work adequately in terrible conditions. War is always terrible conditions. So we are defeated by primitive chaos. You're defeated by adaptive chaos, corrected gently. There's a difference. Our systems look chaotic because they give individual people decision-making authority. But chaos with intelligent people making good decisions works better than order with everyone following bad procedures. She leaned forward. Fleet Master, the Imperium isn't defeated because your soldiers are weak or your ships are inferior. You're defeated because your logistics doctrine can't handle the kind of war we fight. We don't follow predictable patterns. We don't optimize for efficiency. We optimize for adaptability. "They were correct," said bitterly. "You can deliver mail very effectively." Smiled. "They don't understand that wars are won by mail delivery. Well, by beans, bullets, and bandages, but the principle is the same. Amateurs talk about strategy and tactics. Professionals talk about logistics and sustainability. Humans learned that lesson the hard way, over and over, until it became part of our military culture." The ceasefire negotiations took another week. The terms were reasonable on both sides. The Imperium would withdraw from occupied coalition territory. The coalition would cease raids on supply lines. Both sides would establish a demilitarized zone and begin formal peace talks. On the day the ceasefire took effect, stood in what had been Supply Depot 17 and was now Coalition Logistics Command Headquarters. Her team had grown from 20 officers to 200, with representatives from 15 different species. The supply mesh network covered all coalition space and was being studied by a dozen civilian corporations for peacetime adaptation. Lieutenant found her staring at the holographic display showing blue and red zones separated by a peaceful yellow buffer. "Thinking about what comes next?" he asked. "Thinking about what we proved," said. "Everyone assumed humans would contribute muscle. More ships, more soldiers, more firepower. Instead, we contributed spreadsheets and supply routes." "Pretty impressive spreadsheets." "Yeah," smiled. "You know what the best part is? We're going home as the species that won a war with logistics, not because we're better warriors, not because we have superior technology, because we failed at supply chains so many times in our history that we learned how to do it right." Park joined them, carrying 3 cups of coffee. "To human logistics," she said, raising her cup. "May our enemies never learn from our mistakes as well as we did." They clinked cups and drank. On the display, coalition and ships moved to their new positions, establishing the ceasefire zones. Supply ships resumed peaceful routes. Depot workers began the long process of shifting from war footing to peace operations. High Coordinator appeared in the doorway, his segmented body moving with what had learned to recognize as good humor. "Commander, the Council wishes to award you the Star of Logistics, First Class. The ceremony is next week." "I appreciate that, sir, but my team deserves the recognition." "Your team will receive appropriate honors," assured her, "but you deserve special acknowledgement. You changed how the entire galaxy thinks about supply management." He paused. "I am curious. Did you truly expect this outcome when you arrived at Depot 17? Thought back to that first day, walking through warehouses full of mismanaged supplies while lectured her about AI efficiency. Honestly, sir, I expected to be stuck in a backwater depot filing reports for a year before someone sent us home. I never imagined we'd change the war. Yet you did, how? Because someone gave us a chance to try. Looked at the display, at the peaceful buffer zone that had been bought with better supply chains rather than more bloodshed. And because humans have been failing at logistics for 10,000 years, we've learned every way to do it wrong. That finally taught us how to do it right. Translator crackled with what might have been laughter. Your species is most unusual, Commander. You celebrate your failures. We learn from them, corrected. There's a difference.